Here's something that made me feel a little foolish when I first saw it. I thought, I've got a backyard garden that takes up a good chunk of my yard. Raised beds, in-ground rows, plenty of space, and most years I'm still running to the grocery store every week for produce. Meanwhile, I visited an Amish family a few years back and watched a grandmother walk out her back door into a garden that was honestly smaller than mine, and she was feeding 12 people from it. Not just feeding them in July when everything's coming in at once, feeding them in November, in January, in March, fresh, canned, cellared, fermented. 12 people, 3 meals a day, and the garden handled it all with room to spare. I stood there looking at her rows and thought, what am I doing wrong? Because it wasn't about the size of the garden, it was about what she was doing with every single square foot of it. Today I'm going to walk you through exactly how Amish families pull that off step by step so you can start getting 2, 3, even 4 times more food out of the space you already have. And stick around to the end because I'll share a simple interplanting trick they use that essentially gives you a free extra crop without adding a single square foot to your garden. I'll be honest, for most of my gardening life, I planted the way most Americans plant, wide rows, plenty of space between everything, one big planting weekend in May, and then I'd ride it out until frost. My garden looked neat. It photographed well, but about half the soil was just sitting there empty between rows, doing nothing but growing weeds. When I started studying how Amish families use their garden space, I realized my garden wasn't underperforming because it was too small. It was underperforming because I was only using about half of it at any given time. The Amish don't have the luxury of wasted space. When your family has 10 or 12 miles to feed and you don't drive to the grocery store, every square foot has to earn its place. That discipline is what makes their garden so remarkably productive. And the good news is you can apply the same principles without changing the size of your garden at all. The core of the Amish approach comes down to a way of thinking about a garden that's fundamentally different from how most of us were taught. We think of a garden as a place where plants grow in summer. They think of a garden as a food production system that operates 12 months a year. That shift changes everything. It means every bed has a job and every season. It means when one crop comes out, another goes in that same week. It means the harvest isn't just eaten fresh, it's preserved on a schedule so that the January table looks almost as full as the July table, and it means nothing is wasted. Every kitchen scrap, every spent plant, every fallen leaf goes back into the soil to feed next year's crops. This isn't about working harder or having more land. It's about refusing to leave any productivity on the table. A well-managed Amish garden of about 2,500 square feet, that's roughly 50 feet by 50 feet, can produce enough to feed a large family year-round. Most American backyards have that much space in the lawn alone. The potential is already right outside your door. Let me show you how to unlock it. The first thing the Amish do differently is how tightly they plant. Most of us were taught to follow the spacing on the seed packet, which is designed for conventional row gardening with wide paths between each row for a tiller or wheelbarrow. That spacing wastes enormous amounts of growing area. The Amish plant based on the mature spread of each plant, not the machinery that needs to pass between rows. Here's what that looks like in practice. A conventional tomato layout might put plants 2 feet apart in rows that are 4 to 5 feet apart. That means each tomato plant occupies about 8 to 10 square feet of garden space. An Amish intensive layout puts staked or caged tomatoes about 18 to 24 inches apart in beds that are 3 to 4 feet wide with narrow paths of just 12 to 18 inches between beds. Each tomato now occupies about 4 to 6 square feet. You've nearly doubled your tomato density without crowding the plants. The same principle applies across the board. Conventional carrot rows are typically 12 to 18 inches apart. Amish intensive spacing puts carrot rows just 3 to 4 inches apart in a wide bed, sowing seeds about 2 inches apart within the row. A 4-foot wide bed of carrots planted this way produces roughly 4 times the yield of the same bed planted in conventional rows. Lettuce goes in at about 8 inches apart in all directions rather than in single rows with a foot between them. Bush beans go in 4 to 6 inches apart in staggered double or triple rows within a bed. Peppers go in at 15 to 18 inches apart rather than the 2-foot spacing most. packets recommend. Now, there's an important catch here, and the Amish know it well. Intensive spacing only works if your soil can support the demand. More plants per square foot means more competition for nutrients and water. That's why Amish families amend their beds heavily with compost every single year, usually 2 to 3 inches worked into the top 6 to 8 inches of soil each spring. They also mulch between plants with straw to retain moisture and suppress the weeds that tighter spacing leaves less room for. If you try intensive spacing without building up your soil first, you'll get crowded, stressed plants instead of abundant ones. The soil comes first, the tight spacing comes after. The second technique is one the Amish practice almost religiously, and it's the one that probably adds the most food to their table over the course of a full season. They never let a bed sit empty. The moment one crop is harvested, another goes in. This is succession sowing, and the Amish do it with a discipline most of us never consider. Here's a simple example. They sow a short row of lettuce in early April. 3 weeks later, another short row. 3 weeks later, another. By the time the first row bolts in the heat of June, they've got 3 more rows behind it still producing. When the last lettuce row bolts in midsummer, that bed doesn't sit idle. It immediately gets replanted with a fast fall crop like turnips or radishes, which mature in 30 to 45 days and fill the gap before a late planting of spinach or kale goes in for fall and winter harvest. Bush beans are another prime succession crop. They sow a new row every 3 weeks from late spring until about 10 weeks before the first expected frost. That keeps fresh beans coming to the table for months instead of one big glut followed by nothing. Radishes go in every 2 weeks, beets every 3 to 4 weeks. Each planting is small, maybe just 4 or 5 feet of row, but the cumulative production over a full season is enormous. The key to making succession sowing work is a simple calendar. The Amish don't keep it in their heads. They keep a written planting schedule, often handed down and refined over generations, that tells them exactly what to plant and when. You can do the same thing with a basic notebook. Write down your last frost date, your first frost date, and then count backward and forward to map out every planting window for every crop you want to grow. That 30 minutes of planting in February is what separates a garden that produces for 4 months from one that produces for 8. The third technique is one that the Amish use to essentially create more garden space out of thin air. They grow up. Vertical growing turns fences, trellises, and simple pole structures into productive growing surfaces that take up almost no ground area. Pole beans trained up a simple TP of 6-foot stakes produce roughly twice the yield of bush beans in the same ground footprint, and they keep producing for weeks longer. Cucumbers grown on a vertical trellis take up about 2 square feet of ground space instead of the 12 to 16 square feet a sprawling vine would claim. The fruit hangs straight, develops more evenly, gets better air circulation, and is easier to spot and pick. Amish families often run a simple wire or string trellis along the south side of their garden fence for cucumbers, small melons, and winter squash. The fruit gets maximum sun exposure, the vines stay off the ground where they're vulnerable to rot, and the bed below the trellis stays open for a low-growing crop like lettuce or radishes. For tomatoes, the Amish typically use sturdy wooden stakes 6 to 8 feet tall and prune to 1 or 2 main stems. This keeps the plant vertical and productive in a narrow column rather than letting it sprawl into a wide bush. A staked pruned tomato can produce 10 to 15 pounds of fruit in a space barely 18 inches wide. You don't need expensive trellising systems. A few 8-foot wooden stakes, some garden twine, and basic pruning give you a dramatic increase in production per square foot. The Amish have been doing this with scrap lumber and baling twine for generations. Now, what I'm showing you today is just one piece of a much bigger picture. The Amish don't do anything in isolation. Every technique connects to a whole system, and that system is what makes the difference between a garden that struggles and a garden that practically takes care of itself. I spent years learning how it all fits together. And I've put everything into a step-by-step guide called the 30-Day Amish Pest-Proof Garden Protocol. It's got the complete 5 defense layers, the companion planting charts, the 4-bed crop rotation, All of it laid out day by day, so you're never guessing what to do next. If you want to go deeper than what we can cover in one video, there are 2 easy ways to get it. You can click the link right down there in the description below this video, or if you're watching this on your TV or your computer, just grab your phone, open up the camera, and point it at the QR code on screen right now. It'll take you straight to the guide. No searching, no typing anything in. All right, let's keep going. Here's a technique the Amish use that most gardeners have never even considered. They plant fast-growing crops right alongside slow-growing crops in the same bed at the same time. This is called interplanting, and it's one of the simplest ways to get more food out of less space. Here's how it works. When you transplant tomatoes in late spring, those plants are small. They won't fill their space for 6 to 8 weeks. During that time, the soil between your tomato plants is sitting there doing nothing. Amish gardeners tuck a quick crop into those gaps the same day the tomatoes go in. Radishes are a favorite because they mature in about 25 to 30 days. By the time your tomato plants are starting to spread and need that space, the radishes have already been pulled and eaten. You got a full crop of radishes from space that would have otherwise produced nothing. Lettuce works the same way alongside peppers. Sow a few lettuce seeds 6 to 8 inches from each pepper transplant. The lettuce grows fast in the cool soil of late spring, gets harvested before the pepper canopy closes in, and the bed was producing double the food during that window. The Amish also interplant carrots alongside their cabbage. Carrots grow slowly and stay low. Cabbage starts small and gradually spreads. By the time the cabbage leaves are wide enough to shade the ground, the carrots are well established underneath and actually benefit from the cooler, shadier conditions during the heat of summer. The rule of thumb is simple. Pair a fast crop with a slow crop or a tall crop with a short crop. As long as one finishes before the other needs the space, you've doubled your production without adding a single square foot to your garden. Now let's talk about the piece that makes all of this come together, because here's the reality. An intensive, succession planted, vertically grown garden produces a lot of food, more than any family can eat fresh in real time during the peak of summer. That's by design. The Amish aren't trying to eat it all fresh. They're trying to produce enough surplus in the heavy months to carry the household through the lean months, and that means preservation isn't a side project. It's the second half of the system. An Amish family canning tomatoes in August isn't doing it for fun on a Saturday afternoon. They're executing a plan that started when they calculated how many quarts of canned tomatoes they'd need to last from October through May, and the math is specific. A family of 12 eating canned tomatoes twice a week for 8 months needs roughly 65 to 70 quarts. Each well-tended indeterminate tomato plant produces about 10 to 15 pounds of fruit. Each pound yields roughly 1 pint of canned sauce or crushed tomatoes. So you need about 30 to 35 tomato plants dedicated to canning alone on top of whatever you're growing for fresh eating. The Amish know these numbers the way you know your grocery list. The same math applies to every crop they preserve. Green beans get pressure canned, and a family that size might put up 40 to 50 quarts. Pickles take another 20 to 30 quarts of cucumbers. Potatoes go into the root cellar, and a family of 12 might store 300 to 400 pounds, which takes roughly 60 to 80 potato plants in a well-amended bed. Winter squash stores right on a cool pantry shelf for 3 to 5 months. Onions braided and hung in a dry spot last through March. Carrots and beets stay in the root cellar at 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with high humidity lasting 4 to 5 months. Cabbage gets fermented into sauerkraut, which keeps for months in a cool space. This is where the entire system comes full circle. The intensive planting and succession sowing create the volume. The preservation captures that volume and spreads it across the calendar. Without the preservation step, an intensive garden just produces more waste because you can't eat it all in time. Without the intensive planting, there's not enough surplus to preserve. The two halves need each other. Let me walk through some patterns I notice in conventional gardening compared to how the Amish approach the same space. I did most of these for years, so this comes from my own experience, not from a place of judgment. The first pattern is wide row spacing. Most of us space rows 2 to 3 feet apart because that's what the seed packet says, and that's how our parents did it. The Amish plant in wide beds with narrow paths, nearly doubling the productive area. I measured my own garden the year I switched to intensive beds and gained almost 40% more growing. area without expanding the footprint at all. The second pattern is single planting. We put everything in the ground once in May and call it done. The Amish sow the same crops every 2 to 3 weeks across the season, which turns one harvest into 5 or 6 smaller, steadier harvests. The total yield per square foot goes up dramatically because the bed is never sitting idle. The third pattern is letting food waste. This is the one I'm most guilty of. In a conventional garden, the August tomato glut comes in, you eat what you can, give some away, and watch the rest rot on the counter. The Amish don't let that happen because they've already planned for the surplus. Canning happens the same week the crop peaks. Every pound has a destination before it's even picked. The fourth pattern is flat gardening. When all your crops spread across the ground, your garden footprint is your production limit. The moment you start training crops vertically, you break that ceiling. A single 8-foot trellis of pole beans produces more than an entire row of bush beans while occupying a fraction of the ground space. Now here's the bonus tip I promised, and this is one of those things that seems so obvious once you hear it that you'll wonder why you never did it before. Amish gardeners plant a ring of fast-growing radishes around the base of every tomato, pepper, and squash transplant the same day it goes into the ground. They sow the radish seeds in a circle about 4 to 6 inches out from the transplant stem, roughly 8 to 10 seeds per plant. The radishes germinate in 3 to 5 days and do 2 things at once. First, they break up the surface soil around the transplant, which helps water and air reach the new roots. Second, they act as a living mulch during those critical first few weeks when the transplant is establishing and the surrounding soil would otherwise be bare and losing moisture to evaporation. By the time you pull those radishes 3 to 4 weeks later, you've got a handful of fresh radishes to eat. Your transplant is well rooted and taking off, and the soil around it has been naturally cultivated and loosened without you ever touching a hoe. I started doing this 3 seasons ago with my tomato transplants, and it's become one of those habits I'll never stop. It takes about 30 seconds per plant. The radishes are essentially free food, and the tomatoes genuinely seem to establish faster with that living ring of radishes working the soil around them. It's the kind of small, clever efficiency that adds up to a lot of extra food when you apply it across a whole garden. That's how Amish families feed 12 people from a backyard garden. Intensive spacing so every square foot earns its place. Succession sowing so no bed sits empty. Vertical growing so the airspace above the garden is just as productive as the ground. Interplanting so fast crops and slow crops share the same bed. And preservation so the summer surplus feeds the family through winter. If any of this changed how you think about what your garden is capable of, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Let me know which technique you're going to try first. Now, what I've shared with you today is a real piece of the puzzle, but it's still just one piece. If you're tired of fighting the same battles every season, if you want a garden that actually works with you instead of against you, then I'd really encourage you to check out the guide I put together. It's called the 30-Day Amish Pest-Proof Garden Protocol, and it's everything I've learned from my Amish neighbors over the last 3 decades, organized into a simple day-by-day plan you can start this season. It covers the full 5 defense layers to build a garden that defends itself from the soil up. It's got the complete 4-bed crop rotation system that stops disease and pests before they ever get a foothold, and it includes a companion planting field guide so you know exactly what to grow next to what and why. Now, there are 2 easy ways to grab it. The first way is to click the link in the description right below this video. Just scroll down a little and you'll see it. The second way, if you're watching on a television or a computer screen, is to take out your phone, open up your camera like you're going to take a picture, and hold it up to the QR code you see on screen right now. A little link will pop up at the top of your phone screen. Just tap that, and it'll bring you right to the guide. No typing, no searching. Either way works. I think it's the best investment you can make in your garden this year.